Hi everyone. I want to first of all acknowledge that we're meeting here today on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and these lands were never ceded, so it's still their sovereign territory. And I'd love to pay my respects to elders past, present and any emerging elders who may be among us, and as well as any elders of any other people throughout Australia and the world. I'm Mel Campbell. I'm not a robot expert or an AI expert. I'm a journalist, a cultural critic and an academic in media studies and cultural studies. So I've always been fascinated by robots ever since I was a small child, but it's always come from the cultural and the philosophical side of things. So I was pretty excited to meet Toby, who's got the opposite scientific side of the whole AI thing. I'd love to welcome you on behalf of the AI Lounge and our event partners, who are the International Joint Conference on Artificial Intelligence, the Centre for the Impact of AI and Robotics at the University of New South Wales, and Melbourne Conversations, because we're here for a conversation. But without any further ado, let me please introduce our special guest. It's Toby Walsh. He's one of the world's leading AI researchers, which is part of why I was so trepidatious to meet him. And he's a professor of artificial intelligence at the University of New South Wales. He leads a research group at Data 61, which is Australia's Centre for Excellence for ICT Research. His achievements go on and on. I'm just going to keep reading them out.
No. Please.
But most importantly, he is the author of this book, It's Alive, which is, I can testify, a wonderfully erudite yet readable account of artificial intelligence and robots. It's past, present and future. Everything from the logic piano to killer robots, or killbots, as I like to call them. So I'm here to ask Toby some questions, and hopefully we'll all come away feeling a little bit wiser. The first thing I wanted to ask you, Toby, who were you thinking of when you were writing this book? Who's the audience for it?
Oh, it's really intended for the general public. There is a bit in the introduction that says, this book, there are no equations except, well, there are a couple of equations in the footnotes, but you can read the book without reading the equations. And it's written for, a somewhat educated person who wants to know how AI is going to impact our lives. I found that the media would ring me up almost daily asking questions, and it's never, with respect to journalists present, it's never fully satisfying when you talk to the media. On television you only get a couple of minutes, a really limited amount of information you can impart, and even on the radio you only get 7 minutes, and in print you get a bit more time, a bit more you can express. But I always thought there was so much of a conversation that we needed to be having as a society that, well, I needed to write a book, and then I could have a much longer, more detailed conversation explaining all the sides of it. So it's about the changes that are happening in our lives, and the necessity not for technologists to decide what the technology is going to do, but for all of us to decide. This is a question for society to make about how it's going to impact our lives, and what changes we want and what changes we don't want.
As a journalist, can I just ask, what are some of the pitfalls that we in the media constantly fall into when we are discussing these issues of AI and robots?
Whenever you speak in the media, you have to accept that if in a newspaper article or on the TV station, there's going to be a picture of Terminator behind me. You see, I got off with it today. Only because I was organised, one of the people helping to organise all this. But otherwise, there's always a picture of Terminator. And much, fear of what people think about AI comes from what Hollywood tells them about AI, which is only one particular future and is rather an extreme, typically, picture of that future. I mean, there's a couple of good movies that I think I and some of my colleagues like about AI, but most of them paint a very dystopian picture of AI with Terminator and other sorts of scary things in them, and that's not the things I think you should be worrying about. There are some things you should be worrying about them, and Terminator is way down my list of priority of things you should be worrying about.
I love there's a bit in the book where you're saying, maybe AI at all is not even one of the most pressing issues. What about antibiotic resistance? Maybe we are focusing too much on these big bad creatures and not enough on the actual things that are right in front of our noses. Of course, your book does talk about some of these risks of AI at the moment, and things that you're trying to mitigate against for the future. But one impression that I did get from your book was that the field of AI, and I'm talking about the researchers here, not necessarily the journalists or the generalists, it tends to be dominated by pessimists and optimists. And you give some examples and say that sometimes these can be quite muddled in the reasons why people are pessimistic and optimistic. You use Elon Musk, for instance, as a pessimist, but then at the same time he's a leading researcher in automated cars.
Yes,
so
he's a severely conflicted person. If you look closely at all his pronouncements and all his actions, if he's so worried about putting people out of work, then why is he building autonomous cars, which will surely put all taxi drivers, all truck drivers, all delivery drivers out of work? If he really truly believed that was a threat to our society, then why is he hastening that day? So, and equally, he's very concerned that AI poses the greatest existential risk, threat to our existence, humankind's existence, and yet he's claimed up to $1 billion in trying to get to human-level artificial intelligence.
So you also say that a lot of the people who are the most pessimistic are the people who have the least to do with actually working within the field of AI, and they tend to come from outside the field?
Yes, one thing that you should know is that most of the people who talk about things like the singularity, this interestingly, dangerously seductive idea that, at some point we'll build machines that are so intelligent that they can redesign themselves. And of course, that redesigned machine is going to be better. So now we've got a slightly more intelligent machine, and that slightly more intelligent machine will now redesign itself again. And this is a tipping point. A snowball will take off, and then we'll end up with machines vastly more intelligent than us. In fact, we spent all of last night's conversation talking about this idea. So I can't hope to do it complete justice. But those machines, because they raced away in their intelligence, they may not necessarily act in our best interest. They might decide, this is the sort of thing that these people are worried about, they may decide that, we're just like ants, and our existence is optional, and if we get in the way, they'll just stamp on us. Or they may be much more malevolent. But the people who believe this are not many of my colleagues who I'm pleased to see in the room. But people like philosophers like Nick Bostrom or Ray Kurzweil, with respect to all the interesting bits of engineering that Ray Kurzweil's done, he's not a mainstream AI researcher.
But a lot of these people do have voices that are trusted in the mainstream media, and I think perhaps that's why there's a lot of anxiety about these issues.
Yes, I think we do. Whenever Stephen Hawking talks about AI, everyone sits up and listens. And with respect to Stephen Hawking, he's a smart guy, but he doesn't know that much about AI.
Of course, it's also unfortunate that his robotic voice is the one delivering these pronouncements.
It always seems to be very ironic that he talks about, how the machines are going to take over in his very robotic voice, like he's already been taken over. And his life is so, of course, don't forget, his life is immensely improved by machines, by speech synthesis and by the automation that helps him live an amazing long life now.
Yes, he's really a unicorn in a lot of ways. And I want to return as well to this idea that we're not really talking about artificial intelligence in the short term as much as we're talking about augmented intelligence. But I wanted to come back to this idea of pessimism versus optimism. Perhaps if you see it as a spectrum, where would you put yourself on this spectrum?
It's hard to say. I think I'm an optimistic pessimist or a pessimistic optimist, because I think this is really when you write a book, you discover that the book, when you end it, is not the book you started. And this is what I discovered in writing the book. And all of the things that happened in the 6 months or so, all of the news stories about AI that broke in that time, and all of the things that I discovered by doing the research, going back and reminding myself of some of the history of the ideas in AI. And I discovered at the end that what I really wanted to be saying to people, and what I hope is the take-home message of the book, which is that the future's not fixed. The future is the product of the decisions we make today.
It's true, there's no fate but what we make for ourselves.
So that's why I'm both optimistic and pessimistic, because that future that we're building with AI hasn't actually been decided. It's the product of the decisions we as society make today. And people think we have to adapt to the future, as opposed to we have to make the right choices today. And I think this is a pretty critical juncture in history where like with the Industrial Revolution, we had to make some pretty significant changes to our society to deal with the disruption that happened as people's work was transformed from working out in the fields without any machinery to most of us working in factories and offices. And we went through a pretty profound change, and we did it quite well because our lives are now much better. But there was no inevitability to that, and there were certain people writing at the time who were very right to be concerned. Karl Marx was saying, well, of course, all wealth is going to be owned by the owners of production, and there will be a revolution. And he was largely wrong, but he was largely wrong not because we let the future happen to us, which is typically the default option, and one I think where mostly the outcomes are not very good for most of us. But we actually made some very radical changes to our society. We introduced universal education so that people could have jobs in this new economy, that you didn't need to be well educated to work in a farm, but you needed to be better educated to work in an office or a factory. We introduced the welfare state so that if you were made unemployed by the automation that happened in factories and elsewhere, that you weren't put in the poorhouse. We introduced labour laws so that the owners of production didn't exploit excessively the people there. We introduced unions, again, so that all of us could share the benefits of increasing prosperity that the technology brought to our lives. And I think this change, the automation, the AI revolution that's happening now, is going to be equally profound and require equally significant changes to make sure that we all profit, and not, as seems happening at the moment, that a few very wealthy companies and a few very wealthy individuals take all the spoils and the rest of us are made underemployed and unemployable.
Yes, well, it's so tempting, isn't it, to look back into the past and to see today's outcome as the most inevitable because obviously it's the one that happened. Again, I don't want to get caught up in all these different time travel narratives because then we'll be getting back to the Terminator. However, it seems like there's a lot of panic at the moment about needing to make a decision about what we're doing right now because the pace of this change is so swift that unless we act very swiftly ourselves, we will be left behind, and it will be inevitable in the way you say.
Yes, and if I can still use history as because the Industrial Revolution is perhaps the best, or if not the only example we have. If you look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, we did improve the quality of our lives. Our working week is now much shorter, we live longer, we have greater prosperity. But there was a lot of pain in that process. There was 50 years of pain. It didn't happen without those reforms I talked about, like universal education and the welfare state and union laws, didn't kick in immediately. It took 50 years before the average person's quality of life got back to what it was before the Industrial Revolution, and then surpassed it as it has now. So even if we don't say that we want it to happen even if we don't ignore the fact it may happen quicker, we also will hopefully this time can do it without all that pain. Can we imagine what 50 years of pain as inequality in our lives increases? We already live in a very unstable world. I'm fearful that if we don't get the changes happening quickly enough, it will be a very bad time for our children and our grandchildren.
Yes. Well, let's get back to the idea of history, because
I am optimistic. I keep on I'm sounding so pessimistic. It will improve our lives dramatically if we make the right choices. It will make us all healthier, wealthier. We get personalised medicine. We'll get the best medical diagnosis that you can be found on the planet available to all of us. It will make us wealthier. If we can share the wealth that the technology brings, then we can all be much wealthier, and it will hopefully make us happier. I like to remind people that wonderful Oscar Wilde quote, "Work is the only truly obscene four-letter word." And the robots could take the sweat if we chose well.
That's right. But of course, the idea that you raise is one of sharing, of course, which under capitalism is much harder to negotiate because, as you mentioned just a few minutes ago, we see a lot of these technologies are already in the hands of powerful, rich technocrats who are perhaps in this new robotic revolution at risk of further consolidating their power, their economic and social power.
Yes, definitely. I mean, if you look at most of the new markets that we're developing in this interesting digital world, there are these immense network effects that they tend to be winner-take-all markets, right? There's only one well-used search engine on the planet, that's Google, except in China, of course, where they regulate to make sure there's competition. There's only one large social media network on the planet, that's Facebook. There's only one large, again, except in China, where they've regulated to make sure there's some competition. There's only one messaging service on the planet, except again in China, which is Twitter. So they tend to be natural monopolies. And as we've discovered in other parts of our industry and business, natural monopolies don't necessarily work in the public's best interest. We've had to regulate big oil, big pharma, the big banks, because otherwise unbridled capitalism runs to excess. And so now big tech is actually the biggest industry sector on the planet, yet it's almost the most unregulated sector on the planet. And so I think actually this is where government is actually not serving us well. It needs to be better regulated.
Do you think that one of the reasons why government isn't serving us well is that they don't really understand the issues that are at play or the implications of what their actions would mean?
Well, we could spend the rest of the evening talking about the failures of the current political system. Yes, it's hard for them to understand where the technology is going, but there's a lack of vision, there's a lack of leadership all around the world, not just in the United States. We just don't seem to be able to elect the right sorts of politicians. They're too focused on the short term and not on some of these really challenging longer term issues.
Well, in your book, you divide it into the history, what's going on at the moment, and the potential future of AI. I found the history section quite interesting because we often think of technological progress as a narrative that's almost linear and that never makes any mistakes, never runs into any problems. But one of the things you do in your book is that you explain that there were a lot of these dead ends, a lot of these almost cyclical failures and then rebirths. You talk about the AI spring that happened when research, entered a new blossom.
Yes, the AI spring followed the AI winter when, back in the 80s, when there was a big explosion, a big excitement in what was known then as expert systems, sometimes gets called knowledge-based systems, where we would literally, as programmers, try and take the knowledge that some expert have, someone who's interested in diagnosing lung disease. We would try and sit down with them, and then we would process of tapping into what their expertise, and then writing this all down explicitly, laboriously in a computer program. And for a very narrow focused task, that proved to be reasonably successful. And there was a big amount of funding went into the field, lots of venture capital turned up, and everyone thought, well, it's only a matter of time before we solve everything else. And of course, it turned out that was a bit of a bottleneck to extract the information that way. And then was a counter-reaction with all the money that had been flowing into the field, and we went into what was called the AI winter, when people started to leave the field and there was a lot less funding and a lot more gloom and concern whether we were ever going to succeed. And then it's wonderful now to be back in a spring, or even I think we could possibly even call it the summer, where the amount of money flowing into the field is doubling every 2 years at the moment, and companies are placing billion-dollar bets on building AI. Toyota Motors is betting $1 billion. And lots of other companies are betting very large sums of money. And to see the conference next door is got 50% more students, 50% more participants this year than last year. That's a double. If that carries on, that's a doubling every 2 years. So there's a lot of excitement, and where we seem to be making quite a good progress again. Every day you open the newspaper, there's an AI story about some success, about some interesting story about what AI is now doing in our lives, and it's starting to infiltrate almost every aspect of our lives.
That's right, and you do talk in your book about the idea of invisibility, how these advances in AI sort of get subsumed into general IT, or even just in the way that we conduct our lives.
Yes, it's going to become completely invisible. Andrew Ng, who was until recently the chief AI scientist, running a team of 1,000 people at Baidu, the big Chinese search giant. He has a lovely way of describing. He says AI is going to be the new electricity. And if you think electricity is an invisible part of your life, pretty much every appliance in your life runs on electricity, and every digital device, of course, uses electricity to communicate data around. So electricity is, if we didn't have electricity, if we lost electricity, as you see occasionally in some science fiction story, we'd go back to the Stone Age. It's become such an integral part of not only powering, but also providing the information in our lives. And AI is going to be like that. It's going to be absolutely everywhere. Every room you walk into, you'll just say, "Room, what's in my diary? Who won the football last night?" And the room will biometrically identify your voice and get the permission to look into the cloud and find out what football team you support, and then go and find out what the football result was and tell you. And that conversation, that will be a lifelong conversation. It will be like, that's one of the good AI movies that you can get from Hollywood, which is Her. You'll have this lifelong conversation with your AI that will follow you from room to car, to office, back to car, to everywhere you play. Everywhere you go, this AI will know you intimately, more probably better than your spouse even, because it spends so much parts of its life following you.
Well, this is one of the things that really struck me as well about your book, is this interface between AI, human psychology, and privacy and data. Because we can already see that we treat a lot of these AIs like Siri or Cortana. Sometimes I even overhear my housemate going, "Okay, Google." Which is, I just find that so funny. Like he's confessing something to Google, like it is his priest or something. But we're already starting to anthropomorphise these AIs the way that we do in the movie Her. And the movie Her is almost a cautionary tale as well about putting too much of your psychology, too much of your emotions in the hands of these machines that in the end don't really care about you, but we attribute care to them. I guess what I'm curious about as well is the way that a lot of the research, particularly when it comes to deep learning, draws on a lot of database use, and hence raises a lot of privacy concerns. And I was thinking as well about the way that when I go to the supermarket and I'm buying something that I think might be a little bit quote-unquote private, I prefer to go to the robot automatic terminals rather than having a human person know what size underpants or whatever I take. But the thing is that data goes into the big database, so of course the supermarket knows exactly what size underpants I wear anyway. And it seems as though this is something that we're still struggling with, how to deal with these competing ethical and practical concerns.
Yes, it's something that I think we should be worried about, we should be thinking about. It's distorted in part because when we started down this road, there were things that we didn't really have to worry about. When I signed up for Facebook, I don't know how many years ago, there were very few people on Facebook. You could only get onto Facebook if you worked, if you had a university address at a very select number of universities. I don't know if people remember how it evolved, and then they slowly, and that gave it some status, and so then everyone wanted to join who was in one of these select universities. It made you stand out, and then they slowly widened the pool, and now, even your 12-year-old will sign up to Facebook. So what I signed up for, and the consent form I signed up for, was for quite a different product and quite a different experience to the one I'm getting. Quite a lot less intrusive, quite a lot less, and the problem is that these services don't actually line up with what the ideals that the founders of the internet, the founders of the web, actually envisaged for this open network. Facebook is completely closed. It's a sealed garden. You don't own your own data, and they make you click these consent terms, which are entirely repressive, and I actually think they shouldn't be allowed to ask that information of you, and you should be able to own your own information. It's a very distorted world that we're living in with these internet giants who know more about us and won't share that information, and all the value goes to them. That your data is now their value. Most of the value of, Google is one of the most valuable companies in the world, and all it owns is information. Facebook is also equally valuable, and all it owns is information about its users. There's very little else of value in there. I always say to people, when the product is free, you are the product.
Yes, and I think the trouble is that Mark Zuckerberg eventually wants Facebook to be like that description you just gave of the room, of being able to expand into every aspect of its users' lives and to be wherever they are. He kind of wants Facebook to be like a new sort of manifest destiny from sea to shining sea. And what are the forces that can regulate that? So you spoke just briefly before.
Well, government can regulate that. There's no reason why a government couldn't decide, if we put enough pressure on them, that these need to be regulated. And there's lots of things they could do. I mean, I've said publicly before, and I'll say it again tonight, that in 20 years' time, if big tech companies like Google and Facebook aren't broken up, I will be severely worried for the long-term health of our democracy.
Do you think there's any scope
and actually, they've made it really easy. At least Google's made it really easy because they restructured themselves to form this Alphabet holding company, and then they have all the little parts. So if the regulator wants to know which parts to sensibly break up Alphabet into, they've already told us. And, they've already said we can run this as an independent business. And we've had to do that in the past. We did that with big telecom firms. Marlbell was broken up in the United States, and that's improved telecoms in the United States immensely. It's a much better service you get. And these now really do need more regulation because they've become public goods. It's not that you have a choice anymore. You need to have an email account. You need to be an active member of society to use social media. They're no longer optional. But at the moment they are. Any of these tech giants, they're private companies, so if they decide they don't want you on their service, they can throw you off and you have no recourse at all. And yet this is a public good. And that's why they need to be regulated, as well as all the other things about the excesses of their behavior, their natural monopolies. And natural monopolies do have to be regulated. Otherwise, they don't behave in our own best interests. And it's starting to become apparent to many people, and there are a lot of examples I've documented in the book about how they're not behaving in our best interests, and they need to behave more closely aligned with society's interests. I think it's ironic that the company whose motto is "Don't do evil" has a special tax named after it, the Google tax, to try and force it to pay a modicum of tax, because left unforced, it was very clear it was going to pay as little tax as it possibly could get away with.
Well, you very briefly before mentioned the example of China, which is a different kind of regulation. Do you see that as an opportunity for regulation here, or do you see it as a completely different political beast that we perhaps should not emulate?
I'm not suggesting we need to emulate the Chinese experience, but I mean, we can learn some experience from it. With the only reason there's competition in these sorts of services in China is because they regulated that there would have to be. I certainly wouldn't like to. I'm certainly very fearful of some of the regulations, some of the uses and abuses that will happen in China, because they have so much information. The government has so much information about people, and they do try and very closely control what goes on. So I think we should try and definitely avoid some of those things. But you see that without regulation, you won't get big tech companies either in communist systems or in democratic ones, democratic capitalist systems, working very well.
So perhaps people who are working in the field already know this, but perhaps for the benefit of those who, like me, are not specialists, what percentage or what proportion do you think of AI research is done by universities or with government help, or versus private companies and non-profit organisations? What do you think is the split?
That's a great question, because, again, it goes to a concern that we're starting to have, or some of us are starting to have in the AI research communities, that AI used to be something that was done largely in universities. And there was a certain amount of work on AI in industry, but now it's reversing. There are billion-dollar bets, as I said, being made by industry to actually win the AI race. And if it's a winner-take-all market, then we may end up with some small number of companies owning everything, and the rest of us being left behind. So that is something to be worried about, that they actually may just keep it secret to themselves, and that we don't share, we the rest of the public don't share the benefits.
And does the community, the AI community, treat each node as its own competitive note, or do you collaborate more? You talk in the book about, and this is, by the way, the only thing that you mentioned in the book that gave me that sense of future vertigo, you know, when you feel really, whoa, is the idea of co-learning.
Yes.
The idea that one node on a network's learning can instantly be applied to all the others, and that any individual in this room, or indeed in the world, could have all the knowledge of every human. It made my head want to explode like Kate Blanchett in the Indiana Jones movie when she wants to know everything. But in a practical sense, what level of collaboration is there? Do you share each other's learnings? Do you build upon each other?
That's the beauty of the scientific method, right? We're all working this week, next week, across the road, sharing our latest results with others. That's why science progresses so fast, and that's the beauty of the scientific process, that we all publish freely our work, and all of us, as to quote Isaac Newton, all of us stand on the shoulders of each other. And that's how science is such a beautiful social process. I don't think people outside necessarily appreciate quite how social process that science is. They think maybe we're sitting there in our white coats. But it's a very social process, and it's going on all week here in Melbourne at the convention centre. So that is worrying, though, if it ends up in large tech companies and it stops being shared around and it becomes secret. So that would be a great loss to society. That would be a great loss for all of us if it ends up with only a few people owning those fruits. But maybe we should just, since you brought up co-learning, maybe I can say a little more about co-learning.
Okay, please.
Because it goes to this question of why the AI revolution may be surprisingly fast. We're used to learning everything ourselves. If you learn to ride a bicycle, it doesn't really help me very much to learn to ride a bicycle. I have to get on the bicycle and fall off it just as many times as you did, probably. But with computers, the beautiful thing about computers is that they can share each other's code. And that once one automated bicycle, has gone through the process of using its machine learning to learn how to cycle properly, I can just take that code and instantly put it on every other automated bicycle on the planet, and they can all cycle as well as that. And we don't have that as humans. And so we're used to the painful fact of learning is something that we all do individually. And we're not used to the idea that learning can be planet-wide. And that's already happening today. Tesla cars upload their experiences of driving down the highway. Every Tesla car uploads experience every evening. And then those experiences then can be shared with all of the rest of the Teslas on the planet the next day. And so we will be surprised, because we'll think of the linear, slow way that we learn, as opposed to this much faster planet-wide scale. And if you think, if we humans could do that, then you would speak every language on the planet, because someone speaks it there, you could just upload that bit of code. We'll be able to play every instrument every musical instrument that's ever been invented. We'll be able to prove theorems like Euler, one of the best mathematicians that ever existed. We'll be able to compose music like Bach, one of the best music composers ever existed. We'll be able to write like Shakespeare or Wordsworth. We'll have the same talents as anyone else on the planet.
We'll be able to do kung fu like Neo in The Matrix.
Yes, we'll have all of those skills and more.
I'm just being facetious, but again, The Matrix is another one of these pop cultural explorations of the idea that things can be digitised and uploaded, and that knowledge is both subjective but malleable at the same time. Look, let's talk about the singularity.
Well, not too much, because we talked about it all last night.
Sure. Well, I guess I'm not really...
You should have come last night if you weren't here.
Oh, well. Who was here last night, just out of interest? Maybe there are a few enough people that we can get away with a little bit of duplication. But I guess what I was really struck by, because I'm as sort of anxious about the idea of being overtaken by AI, as I think a lot of other people in the general population are. But I found your book quite comforting, because you're saying that there are actually some mathematical barriers towards achieving a singularity, and it's not even the kind of mathematical singularity that you see in pure mathematics. Instead, there are practical. Can you talk a little bit about some of the impediments to...
Sure. So there's a section of the book entitled "Why the Singularity May Never Be Near," which is for those of you who know your literature, that's a play on the title of one of Ray Kurzweil's works, which is, why the singularity is near. And if you read books like Bostrom's Superintelligence, there's almost an inevitability in that book of this idea that we will have machines that can recursively self-improve, and that they will quickly get much more intelligent than us. And so I wanted to spend a bit of time trying to lay to rest, and unfortunately I seem to have succeeded in your case at least, this idea, this inevitability of this idea, and to give you a number of reasons why it might not happen. Of course, it's impossible in science to say never. We should have learned enough in science to know that saying never without an actually concrete reason is typically a foolish thing to do. But there are lots of reasons, lots of technical reasons why the singularity might never happen. I mean, one is just simply that you might just run into some fundamental limit of what intelligence is. We know almost every other area of science has limits. We know that you can't accelerate past the speed of light. We know that you can't look at things with greater precision than the quantum uncertainty allows, the Planck uncertainty allows you to see. So we know lots of limits, and there may be just a limit to intelligence. If you go into, we know there are some limits of intelligence. I mean, if you go into the casino and you're going to bet on roulette, then the best thing you can do is walk out of the casino, because the wheel is literally loaded against you, right? The 0 and the 0 mean that the bank's going to take money. And it doesn't matter how smart you are, how much more you think about the problem, you can't do better than that. The uncertainty of the world means that is the best strategy, and you don't have to be that smart to work out that is the best strategy. And you can't be any smarter about this problem than that. Or it may be like Peter Norvig, who is head of research at Google, observed when he was said, well, if I think about the Middle East problem, there's a big problem. He said, I could think about it for longer. If I was smarter, I could think about it, quicker and possibly even longer again. But I still don't think I'll solve the problem. It's not a problem of intelligence that's holding us back from solving the Middle East. It's some other things, and it doesn't matter how smart you are, you're not going to be able to really crack this centuries-old problem, and it's not intelligence that's holding us back. So we may start building machines that improve themselves, but they may run into some pretty hard limits. And there are lots of other reasons. So it may be that to build machines that are able to improve themselves, we have to build machines that are much more intelligent than us, because we can't improve our intelligence. We're pretty much the same intelligence we always were. And maybe we're not smart enough to build such machines, so we cannot actually get to the starting point. Not only will it not happen, but it will happen because we can't even get to the beginning. So there's a half a dozen reasons. I'm not going to bore you with all of them now, but I am going to try and reassure you that it's not inevitable that machines will wake up and overnight the machines will be much more intelligent than us. Although, like many of my colleagues, I'm pretty convinced we will build machines that are as intelligent as us, and most likely machines that are much more intelligent than us. We'll just have to do it the old-fashioned way, which is engineer them ourselves.
One thing that also struck me while I was reading your book was the difference between the human brain, the organic brain, and any attempt to synthesize that either with a robotic, actual physical brain, or with AI, a virtual brain. And the human brain is slow, and
yes.
it needs it's very fragile and gets tired quite quickly, but it's in other ways very robust and much, much more sophisticated than even the hugest databases that we have available to synthesize it with deep learning.
Yes, and we have all these other things in our brains, like our consciousness. And of course, machines have no consciousness today, and we have other things that seem to be really integral to our intellectual lives, like emotions. And the machines have no emotions, and it's not clear if they'll ever have emotions, or it's not clear if they'll ever have consciousness. So there are many things that our brains may be different to our artificial intelligence. When we talk about artificial intelligence, people tend to focus their attention on the intelligence, and they sort of ignore the word artificial. And it's actually, although many of us have misgivings about the name, it's actually a very useful pointer. The intelligence that we build in AI may be a very artificial, different intelligence to our own natural intelligence. I mean, a good example I give to people is flight. Artificial flight in aeroplanes is very different to natural flight, birds and bees. If we were still trying to build intelligence by artificial flight, by building feathers and flapping our wings, I doubt we would be even flying. We really don't understand how feathers work yet. But we came to another engineering solution to the problem, which involves fixed wings and lots of power, and is actually a much better way of getting flight. We fly much farther and much faster than birds do. It's the same theory, it's the same science, it's aerodynamics. We're solving the same equations of aerodynamics to get flying, but we've come at it a very different way. Evolution finds one solution, it doesn't necessarily find the best solution, and we found perhaps arguably an even better solution. Evolution never found the axle and the wheel, and yet those are one of the most efficient ways to move through the plane. So AI may look very different to our natural intelligence, which is going to be interesting.
And I think also the process of having arrived at where we are seems very logical to us, because we, again, have been able to look at it as if it's a step-by-step process. But projecting what might happen in the future just leads to 1,000 million, billion, trillion different ideas about the directions that research could possibly go in. You mention in your book sort of 4 tribes of different kinds of researchers. The learners, the reasoners, the roboticists and the linguists. Yes. And can you talk a little bit about what separates those 4 groups of researchers?
So it was the part of the book as I was trying to explain what are the parts of AI. And there are those dominant camps or tribes, as I called them in the book. There are the reasoners, who are often driven by things like logic. We do reason about problems, and systems like logic are often part of that process. So there are people who try and get computers to reason, just like we do reasoning. That's what some of the perhaps most difficult and challenging thinking that we do is when we're trying to reason about problems. And so people try and write programs to do that. The learners, on the other hand, is based upon this nice observation, which is, well, most of us started out not being very intelligent. When we were born, we knew almost nothing, and we had very limited intelligence. And most of what we know and most of our intelligence comes because we learned it. We learnt it as children, as toddlers, and then we went to school and learnt even more, and then some of us went to university and learnt even more, and then most of us carry on learning as we live our lives. And so there's no reason why we can't teach computers in a similar sort of way. We're still writing learning programs that are much less capable and competent than humans at learning. We can learn from one example. The programs we write still need billions of examples to learn from. But clearly, one way to get to intelligence would be like we got to intelligence, which is by learning. And so there's a big, very, very fastly moving area at the moment called machine learning, and special parts of that, like deep learning, inspired in part by how the human brain works. And then there are some other tribes there. There are the roboticists. And one very interesting and strong idea in robotics is that our intelligence is embodied in the way that we interact with the real world. If you cruelly kept someone locked up in a room, not able to experience the world, then they would struggle to become intelligent. And that our intelligence is perhaps arises out of the complex interactions that we have with the real world, and that all the things that we think about are grounded in how objects behave and act in the real world. So you can't build intelligence if it's not in something like a robot or in something like us. It's got to be something acting in the real world to be able to get that sort of complexity. So some of robotics, a lot of robotics is driven by this idea that we'll get intelligence by getting it out acting in the real world.
So robotics also has a big challenge of perception, doesn't it? Because in order to interact with the world, you need to be able to perceive it.
Yes, definitely. I mean, a lot of the way we experience the world is through our eyes, and so a big part of robotics is what's called computer vision or machine vision, which is trying to get computers to understand the visual part of the world. And of course, that's great to help robots navigate around, or your autonomous car to drive around. But again, it's a big chunk of our brain is devoted to actually understanding scenes and to understanding how the real world changes. And then the final part is the final tribe, in some sense, the natural language. That language and thought seem to be very closely related. I mean, we think in language. That's how we seem to experience it. And language is a big part of the way we acquire new knowledge and the way that we learn. Language seems to be, certainly in the natural world, closely connected to our intelligence. We have the richest language and we are the most intelligent species. And there are other species that have much more limited forms of language, and they typically have more limited forms of intelligence. And those species that have no language at all tend to be much less intelligent again. So language seems to be a very integral part of our intelligence. And so if we're going to make machines intelligent, we have to then focus on making machines understand language. And that's what natural language processing, the natural language part of AI is focused on.
And also the natural language research is often focused on robots interacting with people. And of course, there's a very long history of that. And it's tied up with this idea of deception, or how to fool the human interlocutor into thinking that they're dealing with another human. Let's talk about Alan Turing.
Yes. Well, it's wonderful. We have to talk about Alan Turing because he is one of the fathers of AI, and he was so many years ahead, and he died, sadly, a very tragic early death. He is also famous for giving one of the most well-known memes ideas that has, in some sense, haunted AI ever since, which is the idea of the Turing test, which is, he asked the question, well, how are we going to know when we've succeeded? How are we going to know that we've built a machine that's intelligent? And he took a very functional approach to answering this question, saying, well, it's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, but how do I know that you're intelligent? Well, you act like someone. I ask you questions and you say all the right things back. And so he came up with this idea of the Turing test, that we could do this. It might be a one against two competition where you talk to a machine and you talk to a person, and you have to work out which is the machine and the person. Of course, you can't talk to them because you'll just see that, it's just a robot. So it has to be behind a terminal or in another room, so that you're both seeing for both of them the same sorts of information. And that Turing test has been seen by many people as the goal of AI, which is actually one of these big misconceptions. No one across the road is talking about the Turing test or how close we are to passing the Turing test. It was more what I think the Germans would call a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment, just to help us understand what we are aiming for and to understand what is thinking. What would it mean for a machine to be thinking? And I don't think, it's hard to know, but because sadly Turing's not here anymore, but I somehow doubt that he really meant that we would be running Turing tests every year or every few years to see how close we were. He saw it as a way of understanding the idea better and understanding what the goals of AI might be. But it has become an idea that's haunted us because there have been a number of examples and experiences where people have mistaken machines for humans, only in typically rather narrow domains, but there have been a number of good examples of that, and people have started to say, well, we've passed the Turing test for psychiatry, or we've passed the Turing test for, there's a nice example in the book, we passed the Turing test for writing beer reviews. I'm not going to say any more about that, just to entice you to read.
Well, I can think of just a few more just from my general knowledge of reading in this field. There was one where an AI came up with paint colours that were beautifully evocative.
Yes.
And then another one where it could write songs. You gave it sort of vague genres within which to work, and it actually came up with songs that weren't that bad, which again raises this idea of, can machines be said to be creative, or is this something that we humans have a monopoly upon? And you don't think humans do have a monopoly on creativity?
Every time we think we're more special than we are, we've been knocked off that pedestal. The sun doesn't go around the earth goes around the sun. Copernicus told us that. We're no different than the apes. Darwin's told us that. And if we think there's something special about us, that we're the only creative things, that we're the only creative beasts, that we're the only very intelligent animals on the planet, then surely discover that we were probably wrong, and AI may help us be more humbled and therefore perhaps treat the planet a bit more kindly when we discover we're not as special as we thought we were. But to go to creativity, there was a nice example again of a Turing test. They ran an experiment where they took Bach's music. Bach, probably arguably one of the best composers that ever been, right? His sublime music. They took a program that was trained to compose music in the style of Bach. And then they asked a professional musician, a professional composer, to compose some Bach. And then they gave it to the public to grade or to rank. And Bach, of course, won. But the human came last.
It again, for me, speaks to this idea that we psychologically or subconsciously, whatever you want to think of it, we want something to be better or realer or more creative than perhaps it is. And perhaps we are wanting, in a way, to be fooled by the capabilities of AI beyond what it's actually capable of. We get really scared when we see those Boston Dynamics robots doing their thing. But then I also love looking at those pictures that come from robot competitions where the robots are pathetically falling over and dropping their loads everywhere. And it reminds me that no, we are not living in the Terminator. There's still so much to learn from, but there are also red flags that we need to act on right now. I want to open up the floor to some questions, but just briefly, I want to be able to talk a little bit about killer robots,
yes.
And the difference, I suppose, between a robot in which the human is in the loop versus something that is given complete autonomy, and what we're doing in the way of regulation. So we've talked a little bit about regulation, and you've been involved with lobbying efforts to do with that. Can you talk a little bit about your involvement?
I can. I spent the last couple of days only doing that to the media. So just open a newspaper or turn on the TV and you will find this conversation happening. And come tomorrow, because that is the topic of the conversation tomorrow.
There's also a topic about work, the future of work and the involvement of AI. And of course, we haven't had a chance to talk about that at all. But you've got a wonderful A to Z of occupations and the percentage chance, according to an Oxford University survey, of their being automated, which you variously disagree with, which is great. Great reading, everyone. Okay, can we talk just a little bit, though, about, you've proposed the idea of a Turing red flag law, the idea that an AI should identify itself so that we can, in this weird liminal stage that we're at, where we're not quite sure what things are capable of, where we can try and make allowances for that.
Yes, so it's named Turing Red Flag in honour of both of Alan Turing, because his seminal role in the field, and also Red Flag in memory of the fact that when we introduced motor vehicles into our lives, there used to have to be, for a number of years, someone walking in front with a red flag to forewarn people on horses that there was something weird and odd coming around the corner that might frighten their horse, and to mean that we safely introduced the technology into our lives. And then as it became commonplace, that person with a red flag was no longer needed. And I think most of us, I suspect most of you, have had such an experience where you've suddenly realised, oh, it's a computer talking to me on the phone, not a person, and that you've been deceived. And we will increasingly find that will be happening in all aspects of our lives. So one aspect will be autonomous vehicles. A friend of mine who owns an autonomous Tesla says that he's had a number of near accidents because people haven't realised the car's autonomous, and the highway is merging, and this car's coming along the side, and the person thinks, well, the Tesla is going to give way. And yet the Tesla is only looking forwards and backwards. It's not expecting people to drive into the side of it. And so he's had to take back control and do that social thing that we do, which is put a gap between the cars to allow the person to come in. The Tesla's just trying to drive at a constant distance and apart from the car in front.
It does remind me of some of the ways in which computers are very good at playing certain games, but very bad at playing ones that involve human psychology and trying to anticipate unexpected events.
Not totally true.
Oh, really?
So Thomas Sandholm is across the road. He's an AI researcher whose program, Libratus, beat some of the best poker players on the planet at a casino for hundreds of $1,000 pot.
And of course, online poker is one of the domains that you mentioned.
That's
in
a
your
good example
book.
of where we need a red flag, a Turing red flag. You don't want to be playing online poker and discover you don't stand a chance because it's a far superior poker bot. You actually want to take your chances against other humans, not have your money taken off you by something that's actually a machine that's doesn't forget any of the cards, doesn't tire, has been trained on more games of poker than you could ever play in your life.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, if you'd like to take your chance against a human, who here would like to ask a question?
As you mentioned, we might not be able to create something smarter than us, but the Elon Musk mentions there's something called Neuralink that he will enhance the human intelligence with that. What's your opinion on that? That we ourselves take a part on this kind of development?
So Elon Musk has done a lot of interesting things. He's a very smart engineer, but I can't understand at all his logic about the idea that what we need to keep ahead of the machines is to directly connect our brains to the cloud. We already have, it's not the speed of the interface between us and the real world that slows down our intelligence. We already have an amazingly fast interface. It's our eyes. You get gigabytes of data per second through your eyes. And yet, if you ask someone to watch a movie as opposed to read a book for an hour, they get far more information out of the few kilobytes of information. I'm sorry, I'm being so technical here. You only get the words in a book. There's much less information in that than in a movie. And yet you learn far much more. It's not the speed that the data's coming in or the data's going out that is slowing down our brains. And the worst thing, if you want the machines to know how stupid we are, is to connect ourselves directly to the cloud and let the machines think, oh, they are as stupid as they sound. So I really can't understand where Elon Musk is coming on this one.
There's a worrying sort of idea that the singularity might be kickstarted by bad programming or human stupidity, as well as
Yes.
our intelligence in creating these machines. Another question?
You mentioned the Turing test and that idea of being able to tell whether or not a machine is a machine or human. What about the idea of, as John Searle proposed with his Chinese room experiment, the idea of how can we tell the difference between a machine that simply simulates intelligence and one that is actually intelligent?
Well, how can I tell that you are intelligent and not just someone simulating intelligence? And the problem is we don't understand intelligence enough to really be able to tell them apart. And maybe that's going to be good enough. And the same with emotions. I mean, machines obviously don't have emotions today. And maybe we could just give them fake emotions, and that may be good enough. We don't know. I mean, this is why AI is such a fantastic subject, because it will tell us something about us. It will help us understand a little bit about, is there something special in our consciousness? Is there something special in our intelligence? Or if the machine does everything that we can do, are we wrong to say it's intelligent?
Someone else had a microphone over this side? Yeah.
Maybe this is a good transition, actually, to my question, because I just would like to challenge the idea of saying that machines don't have emotions, or along at least two directions. Maybe we can say this, they don't have emotions, but would you say that machines will never have emotions? And even at the present time, how can we say that a machine doesn't have an emotion, since we don't know what it means exactly? I mean, I don't know what it looks like to be someone else which is different from me. When I talk about emotion, I'm talking about my emotion, okay? I don't know what it means to be you from inside you. So this is an undecidable question. We cannot say a machine that doesn't have an emotion. Does chicken has an emotion, for example, or not? We cannot answer this question. This is just an undecidable question. We cannot say that a machine doesn't have something which we are not able to define. What is it exactly? What does it mean to have emotion?
Yeah, I think in some sense you are right. We know so little about what emotions are, although we do know that emotions are closely connected to our chemistry. And computers, the programs we write today, don't have any chemistry or any artificial chemistry in them. So in that sense, if it turns out the emotions are both a chemical and a neurological phenomenon, then maybe machines will never have that sort of experience, because they don't have any chemistry in them. The same can be said with consciousness, because we know so little about consciousness. We have no way of measuring it. I have to assume you're conscious. You're behaving like someone. You've got the same biological form as me, so it's a reasonable. Occam's razor would tell me that the simplest explanation of all of those facts are that you're conscious. But it's a leap of faith. You might be faking it. I might be in the Matrix.
It seemed to me from the conversation that you were using the words intelligence interchangeably with knowledge and with information. Maybe you would actually make a distinction, but I think it's a really important distinction to make because of the relation to experience. Like when you say, for example, that conceivably everyone could be Shakespeare or everyone could be, all these different things. It seems like, even robots learn from experience, but the way that a robot, what we describe as experience in a robot or in a Tesla is a totally different thing, right, from what we describe an experience in a human, which has to happen in time. It's not just information. So I think that that's one sort of, it seems to me to be one of the crucial sort of distinctions that sort of is important to come apart in thinking about or conceptualizing some of these things. And I was just wondering, what you think about that. And related to that is a question about diversity in AI and diversity in engineering. Because, of course, I was just at the ICML in Sydney conference on machine learning. And, and there are things, for example, like health, like healthcare and machine learning and healthcare being discussed. And I don't know how precise this is, but I was probably, in my perception, in one out of, maybe 9-to-1 ratio or 8-to-2 ratio of women. And so when you think about healthcare, when you think about other sorts of things and the limited sort of diversity that there is in AI, I think experience in terms of how we create architecture is really important. So anyway, I don't know if you have any feedback about these things.
Wonderful questions. Yes, information knowledge is definitely different to intelligence, which is how we use that knowledge in a useful way. And that distinction should be made, right? It's very easy to pour information knowledge into a machine. It's much more difficult to actually use that information knowledge intelligently. So we shouldn't forget that. But that's, you're still left with the advantage that machines will have over us. For example, we go back to the Tesla learning. Every Tesla can share the same experiences, the same road cameras, radar information that came into every other Tesla. And there's no reason why it has to be experienced in real time, because machines can just speed things up. So that's their natural advantage. We can fast forward time and they can learn much quicker. So that's one reason why they'll learn much quicker, because they don't have to experience the world slowly like we do. We can speed the world up 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times. And the diversity problem is a fantastically challenging problem we face. So there's a section of the book entitled "The Sea of Dudes," that AI is largely a quote from a female engineer at Facebook, now at Google, who made the observation that she was always the only girl in the room, and that is actually, sadly, those statistics are going worse now. For a brief period of time, the number of women participating in computer science and AI was improving. It was getting close to 20%, and now it's back down to the single digits. And we're going backwards, and that's, again, very unhealthy for the field, the development of the field, that you'll get the technology only serving one of the sexes on the planet, and we'll be missing out all of the great insights that the other gender, the smarter gender, can bring to the subject.
Hi. I'd like to talk about collaboration and ownership. So you said that we collaborate. We share. I think we share knowledge, but we don't collaborate much. For instance, papers from DeepMind, they always have 10, 15 authors. We still have 3. So how can we compete? So an example of ownership is like what they did in the human genome. Right? It was companies trying to develop and to own the genome, and then public universities share and work together to hone the intellectual property rights. So in AI, should we collaborate more in an open way so that we own AI when we solve it? So is that a challenge that we should create so that we together solve AI, or should we let Google solve it and own it?
So just to be fair to companies like Google and Facebook, they do publish some of their AI research in the academic community. You'll find them across the road today. We don't know if they publish everything, and they don't necessarily publish all of their trade secrets. So there is some obviously commercial secrecy going on, and it would be great for advancing the field if we did more collaboration. I don't think the reward structures in academia are very well set up to encourage that, and maybe we have to go back and think about it. Occasionally people ask you, haven't you ever written any single author papers? And I think, no, I've written almost none, because that's not the way to do science properly. To do science is to play to everyone's strengths, and if we solve the problems together, we'll solve them so much quicker.
Okay, well, there seems to be a lot of Nobel Prizes for the natural sciences and in physics. Why isn't there any in AI? I mean, it seems to be that AI can have a massive impact on the world, a positive one if we guide it in the right way. Do you think there should be Nobel Prizes in the AI field? And if so, maybe have you got any ideas on what areas?
We do have something akin to the Nobel Prize. We a number of these awards. We have the Kyoto Prize. John McCarthy won the Kyoto Prize. We have the McCarthy Award. John McCarthy was one of the founders of the field, and now there's an award given out at the IJCAI conference called the McCarthy Award. And there's the Minsky Medal that was just started this year. And there's, of course, the biggest prize in computer science as a whole, which is $1 million prize, called the Turing Award, aptly named, because actually, as the book talks about, Alan Turing not only is the father of artificial intelligence, he's actually arguably the father of computing as a whole. He came up with the model, the artificial model for computers that we have today, and he was, of course, in Bletchley Park, where they were building some of the very first computers that were used to crack the German Enigma code and shorten the war by a couple of years. And so he was, such an amazing mind, and very appropriate, therefore, the biggest award that we have in the field. And I'll credit the tech companies, because I know Google and some of the others were responsible for setting up the endowment for this, is called the Turing Award, and it's $1 million each year.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for coming. Will you please join me in thanking Toby Walsh?